There has been a trend towards incivility in this country over the past several decades that is concerning. While this incivility is especially apparent in our politics, I don't believe that its root cause is found therein. Rather, the political dysfunction that we observe is simply a symptom of inadequate moral leadership, and our churches and other religious institutions, at least in theory, should provide a bulwark to protect us against the consequences of this trend. Sadly, rather than discharging this function, it is often the case that many religious institutions actually exasperate the problem by focusing on a message of, at the very least, disdain for those who see the world differently than they do, while often this disdain degenerates into outright hatred of the other. In my view, it is the task at hand for the Christian community to join with others who share these concerns to counter this trend towards incivility and hatred. Swedenborg wrote of the need for the emergence of a new church that will adhere more closely to his understanding of the essence of Christianity. In that regard, he wrote at length about the nature of our spiritual quest, arguing that its ultimate destination for the individual is maximization of the combination of one's own love and wisdom. It is through this combination that leads one to an understanding of the ultimate reality according to Swedenborg. We have talked about the idea before, but some may have missed that discussion. Swedenborg's reasons for stressing the importance of this combination of love and wisdom, it is important that we understand what he meant by love. He taught that love is not an emotion or feeling, but rather was displayed by how we act, that is, by what we actually do. To show love towards another, we act in such a way as to promote that individual's enlightened self-interest. That is where the importance of acting with wisdom as well as love is crucial. According to Swedenborg, love without wisdom is useless, since without wisdom it is often not possible to know how to express love effectively. It is too easy to mistake mere kindness with love. We simply respond to those we wish to love by confusing what they want or think they need rather than providing what is truly needed. Thus, love without wisdom can actually be harmful if we confuse another's desire with what is needed. I think that it is also useful to see faith in a similar vein to how Swedenborg describes the nature of love. We demonstrate love through our actions rather than seeing it as an inner quality of how we feel about another. So it is with faith. Faith is not defined by what we believe or think that we believe, but rather by our actions. For instance, we demonstrate faith in Jesus, not by what we believe about him, but rather in working to live the life to which he calls us, or in other words, to live up to our faith. So as a first attempt to envision the new church in which Swedenborg taught would emerge, I suggest the following. We see that our country and even the world may be headed for some serious trouble if current trends continue. Our task then, if we strive to be spiritual leaders, that may be needed is to demonstrate by our actions our love of country and humanity by combining wisdom with this love. If we strive to be a Christian organization, then we do so by demonstrating our faith in Jesus, by working to understand his teachings and putting them into practice. And before I turn this over to Malcolm and possibly Rich for their ideas, they both know more about Swedenborg than I do, and probably more than most of us here anyway. I just want to make one more remark that I think is pertinent to this the failure of our religious institutions to work effectively to assuage the decline in civility that I mentioned. And Gomes mentions in one of his books, I was just reading about this the other day, mentions in one of his books that the final and most pernicious temptation that a spiritual seeker faces is spiritual pride. And you always face that when you get near the end of your quest. And I honestly believe, I've listened to a lot of people, a lot of sermons, read a lot of books, and we see this. People are so certain that they're right and the other people are wrong. And this spiritual pride always rubs the other side in the wrong way and makes effective discourse impossible. So with that, I'll turn it over to Malcolm and possibly then Rich, and then to the general audience here for their questions and comments. Thank you.
Just a couple of three observations. The first one is a rather personal one. I shared with some of you a letter that I had sent recently to the Washington Post, which they published, which was with reference to the events in Israel and in Gaza. And I remembered in writing the letter my experience at Harvard in the late 1960s, when there were similarly dramatic events in the Middle East, and when those of us at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies represented Israelis, Palestinians, Jews, Christians, Muslims, we had intense disagreements, but we did not have incivility. And I wish I could somehow recapture whatever it was that enabled us to be civil. But I think, sadly, in reality, what I should acknowledge is that those who engaged in the late 1960s demonstrations over events in the United States, events in Vietnam and elsewhere, probably inaugurated the sad process which has now come to its terrible conclusion and produces the incivility that Steve mentions. So that is distressing to me. Reflecting back on my school days, we haven't come very far, or if we have, we've gone in the wrong direction. But let me also mention a couple of thoughts evoked by Swedenborg. One of Swedenborg's fundamental notions is that the balance between good and evil in the world is quite precarious. And I wonder if we see this reflected in today's world, reflecting the title of a book written years ago by the great Christian theologian Reinhold Niebuhr. Do we see a time when the children of darkness and the children of light are in a contention, the tipping point of which is approaching? Do we also see this phenomenon in the fundamentalist Christian religion's certainty of narrowly defined religious beliefs and practices, and a judgmental and censorious attitude towards those who disagree with them on the one hand, and on the other hand, and here I hope I can strike a positive note, an emerging community of mostly young spiritual seekers. We see them reflected in our own church in Washington, open-minded and prepared, engaging the love that Steve has mentioned from Swedenborg, to embrace rather than to reject the other. So I guess the question I pose, and I hope it is susceptible of a positive answer, might this be the enunciation of the new church that Swedenborg envisioned?
Well, thank you, Steve, and thank you, Malcolm. You've set forth an important topic and a timely topic. The one, and I'll just say just a couple of reactions. One, Steve, I just think your capture of Swedenborg is right on. It's very profound and very articulate. I think the fact that love is really action and not just a warm feeling, and which would be the core to civility and love and wisdom together. So that was beautifully said. And I was curious when Malcolm spoke, you talked about how the events that, I guess you're thinking of the events of like 1968 may have led us to this time, because there really is a difference, it seems to me, in the incivility today. It feels to me that it's contempt, and that the contempt would ultimately lead to violence. So it is a very dangerous time. That civility is going to be a critical force in this. And my only observation in doing this work, with this work I'm doing, cultural translation, so it's conflict resolution sort of work, is that I do believe that the role of the new church, or the role of the spiritual person in these times, is much less having an opinion about the debate, and much more holding space for the discussions, or really listening to both sides. It's much less about being right and insisting like, well, based on these two things, this is the right thing, and here's the Christian perspective. And it's more, I find that very much less necessary right now, that we have to weigh in on everything and have our right thing. I think it's great to have our opinions, and I certainly have mine, but I also feel that we need to be more space holders, and less engaged in the back and forth, and more engaged in providing the space for the back and forth, or the space to hear people, particularly people we disagree with. So I do feel like that would be the role of the new church. And then there's another quote from Swedenborg that has been resonating with me lately for a lot of reasons. But he basically says, when things shift, essentially, I'm going to paraphrase, but when things evolve to a higher level spiritually, they generally have to go through a period of chaos, where everything has to be pulled apart and unfitted, and it goes through a period of chaos so it can be refitted to a more beautiful new level of evolution, and you can do away with the things that you don't need anymore. And that would also make sense, that we'd be in that period of, we'd feel very chaotic. The old ways of doing things are not working. So that resonates with me, and that does give me some sense of the moment that we're in. But I do feel like in the long run, it's going to be more important for us to be space holders for dialogue, discussion, for helping people see other perspectives, and much less having our opinion as the opinion. So those would be some of my reflections on Steve and Malcolm's thoughts today. And I'd love to let Steve and Malcolm respond, and then we could open it up to the group.
Well, as a matter of fact, Rich, I was just reading something that was almost identical to what you said about this idea of being willing to listen to the other side without necessarily responding. Just listen and try to understand how they think. You don't have to agree with them. You don't have to argue with them. You don't have to say a word. Unfortunately, I don't remember the author's name. He was a Frenchman. I probably wouldn't be able to pronounce it anyway, but it was a book called The Kingdom, and very interesting, and almost identical to what you said about that.
Excellent. Malcolm, any thoughts on your end? One point of clarification in your comments. You said something like the events that we participated in, you felt like they've led us to this moment. Can you just explain? I think I know what you're trying to say, but I wasn't completely clear. Can you help us explain what you meant about the current moment?
Yeah, I think what I was saying, Rich, is that although in those times we were able indeed to deal with one another in terms of civility, but the events of that time, domestic and international, I think created the divergencies which have grown with time and brought us to the present very difficult and very dangerous moment. I'm just going to say, without wanting to put Annabelle on the spot, it has always seemed to me that if when we're looking for an individual model of someone who knew how to engage effectively with the other side, Annabelle would be that model. And if we could somehow capture whatever it is that she has found that enables her to engage fruitfully with people whose ideas diverge wildly from hers, I think that would be a large step forward.
Should I respond to that now?
Absolutely jump in. And you never know in church if people are like, checking in the other room or something, and you would have been caught off guard, but you've shown your true colors here by being ready to jump right in. So yeah, we'd love your comment.
Well, one thing I want to share is I did get a chance to travel in the South, even before Trump was a candidate, talking to people who were ready to secede from the Union. So that was for my Project Story America. And so I did get a lot of practice listening to people who have very different perspectives. And, one thing I learned from that is that like people everywhere really don't feel they're heard, and that their voices don't matter, their stories don't matter. And so I think that to me is the key to unlocking a lot of the work we need to do as a country is when we listen to people, we help them heal and feel included. So yeah, I do, and this is where, Rich and I really connected, is the need for all of us to really focus on listening more than talking. So that's one thing. I mean, another thought that occurred to me even yesterday is that I've been trying to watch this movie called The Civil War. Probably some of you have heard of it. And I tried watching it. I paid, I don't know, $25 or something to stream it. And I just can't get through it. It's the story I think is terrible, but one thing that I want to share about the subject of a possible civil war in our country is that I feel like we never quite healed from previous wars, like the traumas of previous wars, including Civil War, Vietnam War, Korean War, even kind of ruptures in our society at different points in our history, like desegregation. And I think not being able to heal from those traumas have led people to think that violence is the solution, is a path forward. And so I think instead of just saying we can't become violent, I think we need to really think about a way to offer a path that is focused on healing. So yeah, anyway, that's what I wanted to share.
I have one quick follow-up for you, Annabelle, particularly because you do a lot of work in the progressive community, and sometimes it's said that when you engage people with very different viewpoints, you're normalizing them. That so even listening to, say, I know in your documentary you talk to Civil War reenactors or secessionists. What's your response to people who say by engaging with them you're normalizing them or you're giving them a platform?
Yeah, no, that's a tough one. I get it. I've also thought that at times as well when people have very extreme views. But I think if we get a chance to turn that into a dialogue, a real dialogue, and not just give them a platform to broadcast their opinion, when there is an opportunity to respond, then I think that that's a way forward. So, you know, if when the times I've engaged in discussions with people who have very different points of view, I did try to create space for some kind of discussion or dialogue or feedback, and not just say, okay, just here's the bullhorn, speak, and then walk away from that. So I think dialogue really is absolutely at the core of the democratic process. So people who say dialogue doesn't work, then to me, doesn't understand democracy. So, you know, but that's my that's my perspective.
I never heard, that's a really interesting, unique perspective. If it's dialogue, you're engaging, you're not just platforming, is how I'd sum it up, which is really, I hadn't heard that. That's really helpful. Katerina's comment, my connection today is wonky. Okay. So she's saying that what Steve, Malcolm, Annabelle, and Rich talked about today, it's the biggest reason why I felt compelled to join this church, because here we really strive as a community to open our hearts to people who think differently than us. And I love Steve's point that change begins with ourselves, but as a church, we are responsible to model that for others. Yeah, good point, Katerina. And I would just say, I wouldn't overlook it. When I tell people, other ministers, that we have a discussion after the sermon every week, they kind of like, what? Like, that can't go well. You're just putting out fires, and there's just fights every week. And I say, no, we have very different viewpoints, and it's always civil. So I appreciate Katrina for highlighting what we are practicing here, and we could maybe take this more broadly into the faith communities. But I'm going to now go to Roxanne, and then I'm going to see Sherry, who haven't seen a little bit, so it's great to see you. And let's go with Roxanne.
So I think I would like, since the question is really about what is the new church going to be in this time, isn't it? I mean, you said, you know, what does this new church need to be? So I'd like to approach it a bit from a theological perspective. And that would be, I believe we need to go back to the transcendentals. And Kant ordered these transcendentals as truth, goodness, what is true, what is good, what is beautiful. And then the Swiss theologian Balthasar reordered those to what is beautiful, what is good, and what is true. And the reason he did that was because if you enter into the beautiful, it's much more objective. And then you can start to find what is good. And then you can find the truth. If we start with the truth, we're going to have lots of different truths. And that could shut the conversation down. But if you start with what is beautiful, that changes you. That changes perspectives, and it changes people. And I think that could be uniting. So that's one thing I'd like to think about. And the other thing I would just like to bring up is, you know, I don't think that I can do this just as a human. I don't think I am strong enough. I don't think I'm moral enough or good enough. So I need to be Christified. And right now I'm not being Christified. And when I say I need to be Christified, I mean, I need to enter into the loop of grace with God. And I do that through communion. That ritual is so important to me because then I feel that connection because I am connected. When the elements are consecrated, they go through this sacramental veil, and that is God. The elements in some mysterious way become God. And when I take that in, I have God within me, and I can pour myself out much more into his creation and have that reciprocal type of relationship with God. I need that ritual. And that's what I'd like to say.
Thank you, Roxanne. I'll just comment real quickly and observe your first point about starting with the beautiful. I hadn't heard that before, um, but a lived example of that for me would be when I did Christian-Muslim dialogue. We never started the discussion by saying, "What's your view on Jesus?" Because if we did, that would be the end of Christian-Muslim dialogue. It'd be
Right.
so that would be the truth, and it's a truth in my life. But we talked about what was beautiful, what's beautiful in your faith, what's beautiful in my faith. And I think it's very practical what you're saying, that when we're talking to somebody who we disagree fundamentally at our core truths, we can see what's beautiful in them,
Yeah.
like their family, their background, what they do, how they live, how they contribute. And so I think that's a really good practical thing to start with the beautiful, and you can hash out the true. And then the second point you made, I just think that I do feel like it's a spiritual process to be in this peacemaker role, because does destroy the ego. It means that
Mhm.
it's not about you being right. You're stepping into a spiritual peacemaker role. And I do feel it's God working through us. And I appreciate your example of communion, because for everybody, it's a different ritual. It's some way that we tap into it. And we need practices, and people are desperate for practices. Communion's something you've mentioned many times is an important practice. It's a very important practice. I noticed that when we did baptism for Katie and Jose, and people said to me, "Why are people getting baptized? Like, still, I don't get, like, what's the point?" So I do think ritual is going to find a way back in,
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
there's ways we've got to tap into God.
Yeah, I have to write up my vision of ministry, and that's going to be right at the top of the list.
Perfect. Let's go to Sherry Smith, and then we'll open it up to anyone else. Good to see you, Sherry. Sherry, you're on mute.
Well, I'm so glad I could make it today, because I was really excited when I saw the dialogue, and that it was going to be led by Steve and Malcolm. And I think this is like one of the most important topics of our time. And I do love what Roxanne said about beautiful. And there's a therapist that I follow who talks about that a lot. He doesn't say beautiful. He says, I don't talk about the truth, because people kill each other over what's true. I invite you to have a perspective that's helpful. And does this perspective cause the kind of things you want, or does this perspective cause the kind of things you don't want? And anyway, that's a side note. But my question, so I love that, Roxanne. I love that you brought that up. But my question was, I'm trying to figure out, like, I was actually in DC for a couple days, the last few days, and I went to this like really big, Vital Voices women's event. Hillary Clinton's there, Diane von Furstenberg. It's like big names. And one of the things I noticed, that I have been to it several years in the past, is that this year, a couple things happened that have never happened before. Like, one, some of the employees of Vital Voices like actually walked out during Hillary's speech. Because she didn't mention Palestine, which the event wasn't about Palestine. There were no women there from Palestine or Israel, which they deliberately, the event was about honoring these women from all over the world who were doing incredible work. And it was just interesting to see that happened, that in this Palestine thing was such a big part of the event. And it really sadly took away from the women and the work they were doing and the causes they were trying to do, like this woman from Sudan. I mean, there's some really terrible things happening in Sudan that we don't know about in the US because the media doesn't promote it. And she's saying, look, like, help, I want you to know about my country and what's going on here. Not that what's happening in other countries is important, but what it seems that's happened is we hyper focus on these certain things that are incredibly polarized. And then the media comes in and really hyper focuses as well. And then it loses a lot of what I think civil dialogue is all about, which is listening and complexity. And one of the honorees, Maria Risa, she's a journalist from the Philippines. She's incredible. She was talking about social media, and she said, I've been accused of, being a communist. I've been accused of being anti-Palestinian. I've been accused of being anti-Semitic. I've been accused of all of these things, and none of these are true because I'm far more complex, and these issues are far more complex than any label we can put on them. So anyway, that was a very long-winded thing to say. How do we combat this kind of situation, which is like it really is different now than it's ever been, and it's showing up in ways that seem difficult to tackle, I guess.
Let me go back to the point that Roxanne made about, how do we envision this new church? I don't quite see it the way other people do. I don't, or that has been expressed so far. And I don't, and when I spoke about the need for common ground, I didn't so much mean it between Republicans and Democrats, but more between Christians or religious people, Christians among other religions, between Christianity and Islam, Christianity and Buddhism, and Christianity with secular humanists as well. My experience from what I've read and what I've listened to from these avowed atheists, they're antagonistic towards Christianity because of the emphasis on God, of believing that Jesus is God, believing, about the afterlife, which they don't believe in. So my point is, forget about that stuff. Believe in God if you want to. Let them not believe in God if you want to. But the thing that attracts them and should attract us is this idea of being merciful, what Jesus actually taught. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's what Jesus taught. That's what often secular humanists are attracted to that. We see that in this second reading by the atheist, Kurt Vonnegut Jr. In the Sermon on the Mount, we've been given one good idea: be merciful. Okay, well, that idea, be merciful, is sort of the essence of love your neighbor as yourself, what Jesus describes as part of the greatest commandment. So there's where we've got common ground. And I think there's more potential to develop that ground than there is between Democrats and Republicans. And maybe that's just because I'm not as good as Annabelle, or nearly as good as Annabelle at getting along with Republicans. Although actually I'm not really that bad. I've found that when I'm actually with them, I like them more than when I just sort of hear about them in the news. And then one more thing about the nature of the church. I mean, what religious movements in the past have been successful when they've emphasized the poorest, the least of these. At least the ones that I know of. We could start by going back to the abolition of slavery in England under Wilberforce, and there was somebody else involved in that actually came before Wilberforce that sort of converted him to Christianity, but I don't remember his name. But so that we have that one. To me, these are the four most important ones over the last few centuries, that one. Then the abolitionist movement in the US. Again, that was largely fueled, at least originally, by Christians. Quakers were heavily involved actually in both of these movements, in England and here. Then next we have Gandhi in India. Ostensibly, the Indian independence movement doesn't seem to be so much about the least of these, caring about the least of these. But if you read Gandhi's writing, he's relentless.
Mhm.
on his focus on the importance of that. And finally, there's the civil rights movement in the US under Dr. King, who again, that was about, it was about the issues of the people who were struggling the most.
Mhm.
And then I have one more thought on that eludes me right now. But so anyway, I guess oh yeah, right, I remember now. It's a common theme throughout the Bible. If you read the Bible cover to cover, you'll find out one thing that's mentioned over and over and over again is God's concern for the least of these. So to me, that's where there's potential to find common ground more so than in the political dysfunction that we observe right now.
Yeah, and I think that those divisions, I mean, they can be Republican, Democrat, or faith, non-faith. I mean, they permeate, the divisions are permeating every part of our culture right now. And focusing on the least of these is a unifying bridge. But Sherry, I also want to respond to your comment, which I think it gets to Malcolm's question: is why now? Why is it different? Why is the walking out of college graduations and the walking out on Hillary Clinton and all that? It's this. So I would say we have taught this generation. That's a lesson they've picked up, that they don't need to engage with people they disagree with, and it's now come fully in full bloom. So they are the product of hearing, but that's the product of parents and grandparents. I mean, it's we who have created a society that says if you hear ideas you don't agree with, you can tune it out. You can tune into your own thing, and you don't need to hear other perspectives. And that is new, and that's what struck me with Malcolm's comment, saying that one observer said that when they interviewed students at in Columbia in the 60s, they wanted to explain their perspective on Vietnam. When reporters came to the Columbia in the 2024, they forbid reporters and they didn't want to engage. So I think we have come to a point where we haven't healed, as Annabelle said, and we've come to a point where we have taught generations of kids that are coming up that if you don't like it, tune it out and walk away. And that's dramatic, and that's how change happens. So I think so. The answer to that is I think we have to get back to sort of what Steve is suggesting today is a different way of approaching this, which is we have to show a better way, and the church would be a good place to do it.